Welcome, everybody. So I want to do a big thank you to, of course, Clackamas County Historical Society, Oregon City Public Library, Midway Historic Public House, all of our staff and consultants at the Willamette Falls Legacy Project, and of course, MIG. And Lori Matthews from MIG will be your speaker tonight. Just real briefly, a lot of you people know a lot about the Willamette Falls Legacy Project, but I'm going to do my best 1-minute elevator speech to bring anybody up to speed. The Willamette Falls Legacy Project is made up of 4 government entities: Oregon City, Clackamas County, the state of Oregon, and Metro, and they've come together to help find a new future for the former Blue Heron paper mill. The paper mill went into federal bankruptcy in February 2011, and Oregon City pretty quickly realized it's going to take a lot of hands to help find a new use and a new future for this site. This may look familiar for a lot of people. In 2011, the site was zoned industrial. We went through a pretty amazing vision and master plan process, engaged thousands of Oregonians, and moved forward with a new zone for the site. It has a new mixed-use zone, and we have a new owner. The most exciting thing that happened after the rezone is we received, as a public, a permanent public easement on the site for a linear open space. We're calling the Riverwalk, and that is to get out on from the property out onto the PGE Dam. Right here. And as we move forward, our goal is to turn this pretty boring orange line on a map into an amazing world-class open space. So rooted in the Willamette Falls Legacy Project are 4 core values that we see are essential to the success of the project. And tonight we're going to hear a little bit about the cultural and historic interpretation. Oregon City hired Lori Matthews to help the design team led by Snowhetta, Mayor Reed, and Dialogue. And so as part of this, the Riverwalk design process, we knew in order to have the cultural and historic interpretation core value rooted in strong academic research, we knew we needed to move forward and create a cultural landscape study that really was able to give strong direction and a good basis for our design team to work on the Riverwalk design. And so tonight's presentation is from Lori Matthews, and I'm going to read a little bit about her. Lori Matthews is Director of Preservation Planning and Design at MIG and specializes in research, analysis, and developing collaborative design solutions for significant cultural landscapes throughout the United States, including icons like Yosemite National Park, Denali National Park, Ellis Island, and Hertz Castle. Prior to joining MIG, Lori worked at the National Park Service Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation, where she coordinated the Northeast Regional Cultural Landscapes Inventory Program. Her work is guided by the principle that landscape preservation requires sensitivity managing rather than halting change, with the primary goal of strengthening the historic character and spirit of the place. She holds a Master's of Landscape Architecture and a Bachelor's of Landscape Architecture from University of Oregon and a BA from Lewis and Clark College. She is currently serving as president of the Historic American Landscape Survey, representing for the American Society of Landscape Architects Oregon chapter. So you can see Lori has a lot of great background, and we're really excited that she can help us move forward with this really important core value in our design. Before I hand it off to Lori, I wanted to remind everybody you have these info cards at your table. We'd really like to be able to understand what you see tonight as the biggest and most important opportunities for historic and cultural storytelling, and also to let us know things that really moved you in other places. The design for the Riverwalk really is at its beginning place, and we want to hear from you. What are ways that you've experienced history in a way that was really compelling? We'll have an opportunity to have this online, and please leave space because you may have additional ideas as you hear Lori's presentation tonight.
So I'm going to talk a little bit. We're going to take a little bit of a step back before I talk about the work that we've been doing. I want to pause for a moment and discuss what I mean when I talk about cultural landscapes, because there are nuances to that term that bear some discussion. I get a lot of questions about this. Even my friends and family sometimes don't really know what I'm talking about or what I do for a living. So I always think it's a little bit good to step back and talk a little bit about what we mean. But there is an official definition that was established by the National Park Service. They're the lead agency in the United States that deals with providing guidance for cultural landscape and cultural resources. So what I talk about when I talk about a cultural landscape is it's a geographic area that has both cultural and natural resources that are associated with an historic event, an activity, or a person, or exhibits some kind of cultural or aesthetic values. I think the issue is maybe I think I can hear the air is going down, so maybe it'll be a little bit easier to hear. So that's kind of the term for cultural landscape. It serves as an umbrella term that talks about a lot of different kinds of places of landscapes. There are historic design landscapes, gardens, which I think is the most common thing that comes to mind, historic vernacular landscapes, historic sites, and ethnographic landscapes. These aren't mutually exclusive. You can have a place that has all of those in it together, or two or three. So there can be a place that is ethnographic and also would be a historic site. Another thing I want to just kind of briefly go through is a lot of people ask me, cultural landscape, cultural resource, historic landscape, what is the difference between all of those? I really use cultural landscape because I think it's really an umbrella term. But some people use that just to talk about prehistoric resources, prehistoric landscapes. And they use historic landscape when they're talking about things that are more from kind of the Euro-American, European kind of history. But I really look at the whole broad picture, and especially in a project like Willamette Falls. The other thing that we talk about are cultural resources. And cultural resources can sometimes mean just a cultural resources that is associated with an indigenous culture, something that maybe is below ground. It is often used in terms of archaeological resources. But again, in the Park Service, which is where a lot of my training comes from, it is one of those terms that talks about all types of resources. So historic architecture, landscape, museum objects, ethnographic resources, so it really has kind of an umbrella. Again, I think you're starting to see the trend. I really see cultural landscapes as a more broader kind of term, as a broader kind of resource. And it's with that that I kind of come to you today to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing. The process that we've been using is been developed to understand cultural landscapes. There's a guide. You can see the cover of that up there. And it ensures that goals, visions, plans, and designs for cultural landscapes are grounded in research, that there's documentation, that there's analysis and evaluation, so that sound decisions can be made which take a place's full historic development into account. They can be developed for a wide range of landscapes, like I said, from gardens to trails to battlefields to ranches to kind of any of those things, and I've done that all. And I'm not going to get into too much of the details about what kind of the technical components of a CLR are, but there are three primary sections. The one thing I want to talk about tonight, or kind of make a point, is that the CLR that we're doing for Willamette Falls is really a modified version. We're talking really specifically about the site history, and that is to, as Christina mentioned, is really to support the work of the stakeholders and the design team. So it's focused on the site history, understanding the development of this place over time, so that there's a common knowledge base. So all of those of us in the public and on the design team are kind of coming at it from a very similar kind of perspective. I have found that really helps kind of launch things forward. One of the things that this work really is based on, it does rely on a lot of the research of others. I'm sure that many of you have done research on this site, and I'm sure I've read or looked at something that you have developed. And so it's really based on a lot of that previous research, but it does go beyond that. It does look at more primary sources, and it pivots it a little bit to focus on the landscape itself. And we're trying to reveal kind of new connections and new understanding. We're looking at a lot of the same source material, but we're looking at it from a different lens. And I think you'll see tonight a little bit about kind of how we are looking at things slightly differently. Cultural landscape reports focus on the story of place, which includes some aspects of the people who shape it. But the primary focus is really on the historic events that are tied to that place and illustrate how that place has changed over time. It's that change, it's the place, it's the landscape, it's always rooted in that. How I describe my work and myself, a lot of cases, is that I'm a landscape historian, or kind of a detective. I'm really a vessel for stories and information about place that have been documented in the historic record. And it's my task to make connections between diaries, newspapers, books, articles, maps, illustrations, paintings, photographs, oral recordings, all to piece together the story of how a place transforms over time. What I'm sharing with you tonight is an update of where we're at in the process. It's still ongoing. And then highlight, and I truly mean highlight because we would be here all night and into the weekend if I had to tell you all the stories and all the things that we've learned about Willamette Falls as we've been working on this process. But I'm going to highlight some key findings and some interesting connections with the main goal of kind of trying to shine a light on some things that are not there today or that you can't see today. So what we've done so far, everybody loves numbers. We've looked at 40 repositories or archives. So these are mainly physical locations that we've been to, libraries, the Clackamas County Historical Society, in Oregon and elsewhere, but also some online repositories. And through that, we have reviewed 380 sources. So books, articles, mainly that is kind of talking about most of the narrative sources. And we have uncovered about 1,600 photos and maps, really graphic sources that tell the story. And through that, we have developed a chronology that has about 1,000 entries, individual pieces of information. Here's a little peek. I know it's not super clear, but all that information goes into a very long spreadsheet of information that is sourced. And it's sorted by date. It has information about the event or the piece of information, and any kind of questions that were raised during the research that we can then go back and track. Because when you're looking through this many sources, you do sometimes forget the nuances, and so you need to go back, and this is kind of our guideline. This is kind of our kind of base of information. The process that we're going through is what we call exhaustive. It's not exhaustive, it's what we call thorough, as there's plenty of information, and this is really kind of the standard for developing cultural landscape reports today. It's academic, it's rigor, and information can be tracked to one and typically multiple sources. It's one of the things that we do try to do is triangulate information so that we're not relying on one particular source. We know that there are pieces of information and perspectives on this place that we are not privy to. And since we're focused on the physical site itself and telling the story of the transformation of this place, we've prioritized that over what would be considered more social historical. So we are really kind of, like I said, focused on the place. As a native Oregonian, it has been truly an honor to work on this project. And when I was submitting a proposal to be able to work on this project, I wrote something, and I wanted to share a little bit of that with you tonight. I do believe that Oregon has what we call a genius loci, and that it's embodied at Willamette Falls. This is an ancient Roman concept about spirit of place, and it was translated into what we understand today by the 18th century poet and philosopher named Alexander Pope, and he wrote that some places really have a spirit that's really impossible to ignore, that emanates an almost kind of palpable energy that you can kind of feel, that attracts people generation after generation. The Romans came up with this because they, of course, were conquering a lot of places, and so they would go to places that had that spirit of place and then build their temples, build their cities on top of them. And I think Willamette Falls embodies that for Oregon. It's a place that has attracted people, it's attracted opportunity, it's attracted a lot of different things, and so there are layers of history there. The site really consists of multiple layers, and it's about our people and our stories, the American Indians, the early settlers, the industrialists, our workers and our families. It's about our natural history and our resources, the Columbia basalt floods that poured over Oregon on their way to the Pacific Ocean, and the basalt flows that flowed, and then the Missoula flood that really created our rivers and valleys. It's about sustenance, fishing for Chinook, harvesting lamprey, providing hydropower and electricity, and having jobs with sustaining wages. And it's about a gathering place, coming together as members of an Indian nation, as a community, as a place for visitors to understand the Oregon legacy and what has drawn people here to Willamette Falls for centuries. It is that idea, it's that principle, it is that kind of philosophy that has guided the work that we've been doing as we've been gathering information and drafting the site history. As you can imagine, we've started to kind of organize the information that we've gathered into various kind of historic eras. We can kind of start to see trends. These are the kind of preliminary eras that we've developed. And for each, I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of kind of what I feel characterizes that era, what events were kind of primary drivers, how the place was transformed, and then start to highlight some themes that I feel kind of characterize that era. So long before white explorers arrived in the Pacific Northwest, the area around Willamette Falls was popular among a large population of American Indians from multiple tribes. In addition to those resided nearby, Willamette Falls was a major seasonal destination and center of regional intertribal contact and commerce prior to the malaria epidemic that really started to decimate those tribes. The falls are a prominent feature in the oral traditions of local tribes and an important trading center, with some tribes as distant as Idaho claiming customary fishing rights. The primary tribes that were around the falls were the Clackamas and the Kalapuya, and each group spoke a different language, and each kind of attributed the formation of the waterfalls to different, slightly different origins, though there is a real common pattern when you read through the various stories. We've uncovered about a half a dozen, so there are kind of similar patterns, and I just wanted to share one with you tonight that is from the Clackamas tribe. Coyote was walking along the river before any American Indians were in the valley, and when night came, he noticed that there was a small cascade. He thought it would be good if the cascades were bigger. So he made the falls in the Willamette River right at the place where they are today, because he knew the Clackamas would soon be there. He wondered, what might I do to fix it so that they can get their food right in this place? He put the salmon, the trout, eels, and other fish in the water. He put the elk, deer, bear, rabbit, and rats on land, and he made the trees grow so that there would be wood to burn, to heat the cooking fires, and to smoke dry their fish, and meat to preserve for those times when they couldn't hunt in the rain. Coyote thought some more, and he made the strawberry, blackberry, and huckleberry plants, and then he made the wild cherry, plum, and crabapple trees. He made the camas root swamps, the wild onion, lily, carrot, and other root plants. I mean, doesn't Oregon sound like a pretty great place to hang out? And he thought, when the American Indian people will get here, I'll show them how to pick the berries and dig the roots. And then he realized he was hungry. So he walked down to the falls, and he picked up a salmon, which he roasted and ate there right on the banks. That's how the Clackamas people will catch the fish and roast and eat their fish. They'll have plenty to eat here. I do love that story. There are some other nuances to kind of how the falls were created, but Coyote is always at the forefront of the adventure. And it's interesting because it does talk a little bit about what was prized. It does talk a little bit about the relationship that the early American Indians had with the land. And I think it still rings true to some of the things that we prize, and connections that we have to the falls. Almost all early evidence of the physical landscape of the falls and the region comes from the European and American explorers that were coming through kind of the early 19th century. And it should be noted that these depictions of the area around Willamette Falls that have American Indians in them and show some of their villages are really idealized. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of the source material that we've been using, but I just wanted to point that out. But some historians estimate that there were about 5,000 Clackamas Indians at the falls beginning in the 18th century, and that prior to the arrival of the settlers, the Clackamas lived primarily in the vicinity in the falls, not necessarily on the kind of the piece of property that we're looking at today. They altered and moved their dwellings seasonally. Each spring they took them down in the winter and preserved the cedar split planks and the supporting posts and some of the other materials so that they would be there when they arrived back. The houses were about 12 to 15 feet wide and 30 to 40 feet long. They had no windows or chimneys, but had a hole in the ceiling that would allow smoke to escape. There are descriptions of tribes welcoming early explorers into these dwellings for a night or two as they stopped at the falls and probably saw how hard it was going to be to portage on their way either up or down the river. By the early 19th century, white explorers began arriving in the Willamette Valley. Their accounts are few, but they're incredibly valuable because they do give us a picture of kind of what the falls was like prior to more people coming. So we did actually, these were kind of things that we really kind of looked at and sought out. The Lewis and Clark expedition first heard about but never visited the falls in April of 1806 when they were traveling back east after spending the winter at Fort Clatsop. Clark and members of his team are the ones who met up with American Indians in what is now Blue Lake Park, and found out about what Willamette Falls was about. Lewis was heading on a different journey. They were taking a slightly different path. So it was just Clark and his team. But this is the map that they drew on the left, and I'm sorry it's kind of small, based on those conversations. Another really early explorer whose journals have been documented and have been published, Alexander Henry the Younger. He was the first one to view and document Willamette River Falls. He described a village near the confluence of the Willamette and the Clackamas, and that had 6 lights showing out what he assumed were 6 structures. He described that it was too wet to build a fire, surprise, surprise, in Oregon, and that portaging around Willamette Falls was nearly impossible. And sadly, he described, as he got above the falls and around the portage, on the spot where a former village stood, remained the dead in a village, then they were still seen, they were still visible. One of the other, being trained as a landscape architect, I was really excited to see that David Douglas, a famous Scottish botanist who our Douglas fir is named after, was another person who provided firsthand descriptions of Willamette Falls. He was actually on his way to find a prized pine further south in Oregon. So he passed through here, and he described how large the river was, comparing it to the Thames in London, and that the falls were impressive, but changed in character between when the water was low and it was divided between 3 channels, and when it was high and flowed over the rocks in kind of a single sheet. Interesting. It recalls, it's so interesting to read these people's descriptions from years ago and have it still resonate with what we see today. Even though he noted that the beaver were scarce, and he didn't see a single one that was alive. All of these explorers were kind of just passing through. None of them were staying, but the word was out, I think, about Oregon in this region. And at Willamette Falls, the settlement here begins with John McLaughlin, who around 1828, when he claimed a portion of land that we now know as Abernathy Island. His intention was to establish a trading post, and early work included building 3 log houses, a storehouse, and a lumber mill. He also began directing the first blasting of the rock around the falls to establish a mill race, and the construction of the first road connecting this area to points downriver. It was likely the first iteration of Main Street, and it was the first documented agricultural crop. He grew potatoes. American Indians were not happy. They rejected the infringements on their land and burned down the houses in the storehouse, which McLaughlin rebuilt soon after. This begins one of the most active periods of change at the falls, at the site. And I'm only going to touch on a precious few aspects of it, but the transformation was pretty dramatic during this era. But I also want to peel away the curtain a little bit and talk a little bit about how the CLR process unfolds behind the scenes. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. We looked at a lot of different images and photographs and such, and we do look at them with a critical eye. The 2 on the left were done by an artist named Paul Kane, and he is doing them in person, he's doing them on site, and so we do have a little bit, those were weighted a little bit more heavily in terms of what they are depicting. The one on the right, while it has really good information about the site at that particular era, we look at it with a little bit more, I wouldn't say cynicism, but a little more caution, because it is more idealized. And so like I mentioned earlier, we do look at resources and sources and triangulate them and try to make sure that the bias or the information is kind of true and accurate. And there are times when information from one source conflicts with another, and other times when different perspectives that verge into bias that we really need to acknowledge and consider. We don't feel that every source is created equal. But we do have one other kind of story, or one person that visited was a Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, and he visited Oregon City in 1841 and again 4 years later, and he astutely described his observations, providing one of the best comparisons of just how rapidly the site was changing. In 1841, fewer than 24 Euro-Americans were at the falls, and between 75 to 100 American Indians were present during Chinook fishing season. He noted that the salmon fishing was at its height, and that he had never seen so many collected at one time. When he returned 4 years later, in 1845, he observed a large amount of lamprey ascending the falls, but in stark contrast, there were no American Indians fishing for them. McLaughlin encouraged settlement and was focused on providing resources and assistance to any non-natives who were interested in moving to the Pacific Northwest. Those who benefited from the groundwork he laid were Christian missionaries coming to the region to spread the word of God, and to those looking for opportunities to own and farm their own land. And while the missionaries were some of the first to arrive and settle, the Oregon Trail, as we know, soon made this destination, its terminus, an active and growing town. And speaking of the Oregon Trail, we did rely on a lot of the research that had been done before in terms of the Oregon Trail, but we really focused on the descriptions of Oregon City when they arrived. We were less concerned about the journey, which has been very well documented and written about. So that was usually contained on the very last page of their diaries. We would flip all the way to the end because that was when they would get to Oregon City and they would describe their first impressions, which was really quite charming and kind of wonderful. But it usually ended there, and my guess is that they were turning rather quickly to figuring out how to survive in this place. But as note, their arduous journey would end, and the pioneers would typically speak very glowingly about Oregon City. One such person arrived in 1845, Samuel Chase, and he wrote, "This place is Oregon City. It's been built up this and last year. The greatest water power in the world. The falls are about 25 feet, solid rock across the Willamette River. 2 sawmills, 2 flouring mills are now erected and in full operation. Water power enough to run 1,000 mills and factories. 5 stores, 2 blacksmith shops, and mechanics of all kinds. All new buildings in this town, plenty of lumber of the finest quality. A number of dwellings erected, clothing and other necessities of life can now be procured. However, as winter descended, some changed their tune. Reverend George Gary wrote in November, which we know is the beginning of the wet season, that the sun was absent for a week, and the rains did not abate for more than 48 hours over the course of 5 weeks. He went on, and I quote, "I'm satisfied that the winter will not pass as pleasantly as it would, provided I could exercise more. It rains day and night, and hence I spend in my chamber day after day, night after night." Though he hopes he can put his time to good use, he talks about reading books. He does go on to acknowledge that, quote, "The mind is prone to be like the weather, dark and gloomy." So whether you're from Oregon or not, we all live here now, and I'm sure we can all relate, especially given the forecast that we have in store for us this weekend, also at the beginning of the rainy season. So anyway, I just found it really interesting, people's different perspectives once they first arrived and then once they'd been here for a little bit. One of the things that George Gary may have been reading was the very first West Coast newspaper. It was entirely handwritten, 13 pages, called and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Flumgudgeon Gazette and Bubblebee Budget, a newspaper of the Salamagundi order devoted to scratching and stinging the follies of the times. It was edited by a person known as Curtail Kuhn. I don't know if that's his real name. And quote, "Its caustic editorial style spawned a mudslinging brand of journalism known far and wide as the Oregon style." When a printing press arrived a short time later, unfortunately, the Flumgudgeon Gazette was abandoned. But it should be noted that the first edition of the first traditional newspaper, the Oregon Spectator, was published on February 5th, 1846. So one of the unique aspects of a cultural landscape report is the development of what I'm showing up here, just a little kind of portion of it, is the development of historic era plans. And they depict our understanding of a place at a moment in time. And as you can see, this is what we've compiled for circa 1851, and it's based on all the source material that we've been gathering, so the narrative sources, the illustrations, obviously not photographs at this period. And we typically kind of cull that information between a 5 and 10 year period, kind of depending on how many resources there are. And these are drafts, and I'll show you throughout the presentation kind of the ones that we've been developed, and you'll start to see kind of how the landscape has changed over time. But this is really an incredibly helpful process when you're focusing on a cultural landscape, because not only does it it helps us ground truth some of the information that we're looking at. It helps us ground truth. Someone describes a particular place at 3rd and Main, and we look and see, does that work at 3rd and Main? And so we kind of triangulate the information. But one thing I do want to point out, that there's a red, you may not be able to see that it's red, but there's a kind of a dashed line around the site. And that's actually the current site today that the Design Collective is looking at. So just as a reference point, that kind of helps us see the comparison between some of these earlier plans and what we know of today. The other thing too is that the buildings, as few as there are in this plan, are color-coded so that we can start to track by use. We can start to track kind of how the site has changed, and I'll point that out as we go forward. The next era really focuses on a time of when the industry was expanding. And it was really one of the biggest impacts to the physical character of Oregon City during this era was when a flood struck in 1861. It wasn't the first, it won't be the last, but on December 3rd, the river flooded at an initial rate of about a foot an hour, and it continued to rise for 4 days, reaching a point 12 feet higher than the worst previously recorded flood in the 1850s. Water ran down Main Street, reaching depths of about 4 feet, and the water was so high that there was a gentleman named Captain Taylor, and he ran his steamer, the St. Clair, safely over the falls, as they reported a feat that had never before been successful and will never be duplicated. The most substantial destruction was reserved for Abernathy Island and its surrounding environment. George Abernathy's store, his mill, and his house were swept away, along with McLaughlin's Oregon City Mills that were now run by his son-in-law. The Willamette Iron Works was completely destroyed. The roads and bridges leading to these structures and connecting that island to the mainland were also gone. So as you can see, we're really focusing on kind of the event is the flood, but we're focusing on kind of how it affected the landscape itself. The town would rebuild, albeit a bit further back from the river. And here are really rough kind of before and after photos where you can see how in the one on the left, the buildings are a little bit smaller, a little more modest, and on the right, kind of after the flood, they start to get a little bit bigger, more substantial. The building materials are a little bit more just robust. Here's another view post-flood from the Westland side of the Willamette. Steamboats are up in the basin. You can see the mills, steamboats. This is the woolen mill right here. This is one of the flour mills. So you can start to see kind of how the landscape was evolving. The milling industries were really very prominent, and they were associated with various natural resources at this time: wool, lumber, grain, paper. And they went into it, like I said, a really intense period of expansion. And this went hand in hand with landowners and businessmen starting to jockey over water rights and access to the mill races. A lot of legal documents were read. That was not very fun. The boat basin was another thing that was established during this era. The People's Transportation Company expanded the basin in 1865 and 1866 to accommodate more passenger travel by steamboat. The basin dam and a wood crib and a walk-filled wall were built to create a canal for navigation. The wall extended on one side of Abernathy Island and then kind of extended up towards the head of the falls. Supporting businesses continued to emerge during this era, including mercantiles, hotels, and boarding houses. At this point, the Phoenix Hotel, which was the old McLaughlin House, is visible. The Barlow House, which was a restaurant, and then there's another mercantile down here, which is unfortunately just outside the image. By 1884, the town had blossomed and a great deal of infrastructure had been built. There was a much richer array of types of businesses, and they had filled in the blocks that had been platted in the middle of the 19th century. You can compare it with the circa 1851 plan that's in the bottom corner. Another big development is electricity. I don't know if anybody is from the Schoolhouse Rock era, but I keep thinking electricity, electricity every time I see this image. If you're not from that era, I'm sorry, I looked just like a huge fool just then. But bear with me. Another major development was this, and it was initially started by a railroad financier and a journalist, Henry Villard. And he actually asked a Swiss engineer to come out and survey the hydroelectric potential of here, but then he went bankrupt in the 1880s recession. And so Ed Eastham took that over, started the Oregon City Electric Company, and built Station A, which you can see there on the basalt ledge of Abernathy Island in 1888. In November, they began generating electricity from Station A, which provided light for Oregon City stores, residents, and streets. And a year later, hydroelectric power generated at Station A was transmitted to a generating station in East Portland, which lit up downtown. This is believed to be the first ever long-distance transmission of electricity in the U.S. The town transformed again, surprise, surprise, after another flood, swept over the falls on February 5th, 1890. There was a pattern here in these early years: flood, rebuild, flood, rebuild. So this one had a smaller discharge than the one in 1861 that I described a little bit earlier. The water rose at about 2 feet higher, though, due to the presence of buildings and other kind of built structures along the river, which reduced the capacity of the water to get through. The bulkheads forming the basin were carried away, which flooded Main Street. The road between Kanema and the Portland Flouring Mills was destroyed, and other mills were carried away. And the building that housed the Oregon Mint was destroyed. Station A was still present, though it was damaged beyond repair. As with the previous floods, the rebuilding effort was swift and included major improvements to the transportation infrastructure. The city built a plank road east of Portland Flouring Mills to replace the road to Kanema. And in addition, construction began on a bicycle path connecting Portland to Oregon City, and an interurban railway that was developed to connect the two towns as well. By the early 20th century, trains were running between Portland and Oregon City every half hour. By 1900, the expansion and the densification of industry, businesses, and residences had occurred, filling in areas that had been less developed in 1884, and a railway was added, as I just mentioned, down Main Street. And again, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner the previous era, just to see a little bit of the comparison between the two. The early 20th century is characterized by industries that expanded during the late 19th century, but they were consolidating into fewer companies and endeavors, and the town was shifting its origins along the Willamette River and up the hill. Things, no doubt, were actions and reactions to each other. The number of buildings associated with the woolen mill filled an almost entire city block, south and west of the intersection at 3rd and Main, and it remained a major employer. There's some great images from this early 20th century. Conversely, the flour mills in place since the early settlement began closed or were moved, and with the end of one era, a new one began. On January 8th, the Oregonian reported that Willard Hawley purchased Portland Flouring Mills, Imperial, and brick mills with plans to open new paper mills later that year. Empty blocks along Main Street became open-air warehouses for paper mill supplies. At the same time, elements of the town that were closer to the falls were removed or moved, as was the case with McLaughlin House, from its original site opposite the wool mill to land coincidentally donated to the town by McLaughlin himself for a park. This symbolized the cessation of the town located closer to the falls, and which by this time, 1925, is primarily industrial. You can see the brown, the buildings, those indicate kind of an industrial use. The town aspect is really limited at this point to an area primarily northeast of 4th Street, so right through here. In the late 1920s, after the successes of the previous decades, the mill and other businesses near Willamette Falls would transform and undergo a brief period of major expansion. Symbolizing that expansion, paper machine number 4 was replaced in 1928 with a new newsprint machine that was the largest and fastest of its type in the western U.S. and had a cost of $2 million. The building was also enlarged as part of the machines, through part of the machine's installation. And the woolen building, which you can see kind of there in the background just peeking up, was really no longer the big man on campus. The 1930s were a major turning point for the wool industry and Oregon City Manufacturing Company. In 1932, the woolen mill closed for a time during the Great Depression, which really kind of signaled the beginning of its end. The paper mills, on the other hand, continued to expand during the war years, and by 1948, were producing a considerable amount of paper, especially for Life and Time magazines. Despite this, Hawley and Hawley's heirs sold their remaining interest to the Times Mirror Corporation, which formed Publishers Paper Company in 1950. The new company primarily focused on manufacturing newsprint for the Los Angeles Times. But they did become the first mill to use sawmill chips rather than logs in the paper-making process. With paper's expansion, the wool industry contracted, and in 1954, Oregon City Manufacturing Company started liquidating its assets, 90 years after it's first incorporated. The heirs of the Jacobs family sold the mill property, buildings, and water rights, the publisher's paper, during that same year, and on February 1st, 1955, they ceased manufacturing. Perhaps appropriately, a major spill in 1955 covered the whole mill area in pulp. Historic images from the incident show pulp in the streets, on cars, up to men's waists, and whether literally or metaphorically, paper production had taken over the area of the falls. There's really a incredibly rich collection of photographs during this kind of mid to late 1940s period, and they beautifully illustrate the change that's occurring in the landscape during this time. This image of 3rd Street shows where the larger industrial buildings meet the kind of smaller, more town-scale buildings, though by this time, even the town-scale buildings were being used to support the paper mills. A great deal of kind of that town, that Main Street feel is gone by the mid-1950s and 1960s. It's really a company town by this point. There's also a change in scale that occurs between the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. Some of the human-sized tools and processes that have been used started to contrast with the more industrial-sized equipment, the industrial-sized spaces that really kind of characterize this area in the mid-20th century. Paper is indeed king. And the processing and production of paper products now exists over nearly the entire landscape. With many of these changes underway for the paper industry, the site's ownership during this era was split between Publishers Paper and Blue Heron. The pace of the physical changes, though, really did start to kind of slow. One exception is that in April 1967, a clarifier was built on basalt near the basin in roughly the same location as some of McLaughlin's early mills. And as in previous decades, during the Hawley's ownership, tours of the mills were offered to the general public Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Paper was the dominant industry and would remain so until Blue Heron Paper Company closed in 2011. So throughout this research, I've kind of taken you through a kind of chronological kind of look into the history. We've started to notice many themes that have emerged. We're really in the kind of the early stages of fleshing out some of those themes, but they really do mark kind of important connections between the eras. They start to see, someone describing how onerous the rain is at the beginning. We can identify with that, and so we're starting to see how some of those connections come together. They really kind of reinforce some of the reasons why I feel like this place really does still resonate with so many people, why it has been the center of so many firsts, of so many kind of early developments in Oregon and the region. So I'm going to end the presentation by talking a little bit about one theme that has emerged, and honestly for me has really kind of caused the most heartache, but also the most learning as through the process, and it's really very much alive and ongoing. It ties kind of many of the themes together. It's a common thread of how this place has brought people together, and with that has been conflict, sometimes adversity. Sometimes it's when different cultural groups come together. Sometimes it's when different people are looking to the different resources that are here. But there has been that common thread. It does also follow a trend. I think people are interested in not just kind of the pretty pictures or the beautiful stories, but some of the kind of what the hardships were that people encountered in a particular place. And so this starts to illuminate some of those elements. But the early conflicts that were documented here did start with the American Indians. As I mentioned, this was a gathering place for multiple tribes from all throughout the region. And while most of the efforts when they came together and most of the gatherings were peaceful, there are reports that fighting occurred over land and that resources and control of the Willamette Falls, whoever controlled the falls, really did have a position of power. So there was at least one battle that's been documented in 1814 or 1815. And no, it never materialized. The Willamette Falls was actually going to be potentially a very strategic position for either the Americans or the Brits. Now, the American Revolution was about 50 years past, but this kind of tension was surrounding kind of the War of 1812, when the Americans and the British were still fighting over territory on the continent. And Alexander Henry the Younger, who I mentioned earlier, he came up the Willamette River, and his expedition was really a multinational group. A lot of Hawaiians, French Canadians, Americans were on that expedition. That was very typical of the explorers in that era. And just as a side note, Hawaiians are mentioned quite a bit as an early labor force. They had, because they were an island, they had a huge trade network throughout the Pacific Rim, and so they were quite present in the Willamette Falls area. This map was actually drawn by two British men who were spies. They posed as, new citizens to town, and they were trying to get a sense of the area in case they needed to try to, take it over or defend it, which I find interesting. This is a great map. We used it quite a bit. But the question who controlled the area around Willamette Falls really forms the backdrop for a small group of settlers to enact laws and take actions that nearly always benefited themselves and allowed them to protect their interests and in what they perceived as their resources. This manifested itself in some kind of grotesque ways. First, in 1844, the fledgling legislature passed a law that prohibited Black Americans from settling in Oregon. It also outlawed slavery, but there were Black Americans already living here, and they were asked to leave within 2 years. And while not equal seriousness by any means, the same legislature passed a law that would affect all of us, those of us drinking alcohol tonight. The early wisdom, they simultaneously passed a law to prohibit the introduction, the sale, and the distillation of ardent spirits in Oregon. Not a bright bunch of people. Where's that tradition? So early interactions between white explorers and native populations were really characterized by these conflicts. They raised from cultural misunderstandings, based on kind of, language and other things, to violent warfare. One thing, though, that did happen in 1850 is when 5 members of the Cayuse tribe were tried and hung in response to the deaths of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman and 12 others at their mission, which is now in Washington. But they were brought here to the Willamette Falls. The context of this is really much more complex than I can get into tonight. It really kind of just deserves its own kind of event. But I do want to say that what we've gathered has been through documented source material, and so it's only a part of the picture. There's a lot in the oral tradition that we don't know. But there are 2 points that I want to make, that there are kind of interrelated trends that occurred throughout this region that kind of are epitomized in this story. On one side, white traders were encroaching on land occupied and venerated by the native populations and claiming it as their own. And these settlements often disrupted the living, the travel, and the sustenance patterns of the American Indians. And at the same time, they were being decimated by a disease, malaria in a lot of cases, and smallpox and others, that kind of disallowed them from living as robustly as they had for centuries. So 5 members of the Cayuse tribe voluntarily surrendered, or were arrested, it depends on the source that you read, and we were brought to Oregon City to undergo a trial. They were imprisoned on Abernathy Island for more than a month before the trial was held in a hotel saloon. There was no courthouse at that time. And as many as 300 people attended the proceedings each day, which lasted about 15 days. And on May 24th, they were all found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Questions about their guilt persisted. An article actually published shortly after the sentencing claimed that the 4 had admitted to the killings, but this was quickly refuted by a corporal who had been in charge of, had been with them like 24/7, had been in charge of their security. The Secretary of the Oregon Territory, Kitsine Pritchett, was appointed lead defense counsel, and he fought for a pardon for them, but ultimately failed. They maintained their innocence to the end. And one of the sentences, this is something that really struck me. He said, "Did not your missionaries teach us that Christ died to save his people? So we die to save our people." And so what we've heard is that this group, whether they surrendered or were captured, they felt like it was their duty to come here and appease and try to save their people. To end the threat of conflicts that occurred at Willamette Falls, I'll end on a much lighter note. And it's one example of disputes that occurred over labor. There were many over the years, either between ethnic groups that were working in Oregon City or between those who were working for companies and the companies they were working for. But in 1913, an arsonist attempted to set the woolen mill on fire, thought to be a protest against kind of the labor practices, and he escaped across the Willamette River by boat. Local newspapers, when reporting on the incident, noted the presence and activity of militant socialists hailing from Portland, who'd been hanging around the mill and theorized that hooligans from Portland had been responsible. So with that, on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you. With that, we are also forming a tribal board, which is inviting members of those 5 tribes to work with the design team as we move forward and make sure that the stories that are told on the site and the design can be really directed by them and not us. And so it is that balance we're working with our design team as well as the tribal board. As you know, this process is a little bit longer, so we are having that parallel conversation with them as we move forward with kind of the traditional design process you're all used to with design alternatives, preferred design, and moving forward. So I just want to let people know that we are working kind of on a government-to-government relationship with the tribes that have been identified that they want to be involved. And with that, I want to thank Lori very much for her presentation tonight. And I'm going to invite up Alex Perot, which is the project manager for the Riverwalk. She's what's your official title?
I'm a planner.
You're just a planner.
A landscape architect.
Landscape architect from Metro. So she's going to tell you a little bit about next steps and even give you a sneak peek. And in just a moment, I'll switch the slide for you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. Lori, that was a really great presentation. There's so many different stories and historical bits wrapped up into this site, and it's kind of like, now what? So we're going to be working with Lori, who is going to share this information and the research that she's come together with our design collective and come up with a way, or it's basically a framework for interpretation on the site that will essentially cross all the different phases of the project. So we're really excited to work with that. And concurrently to that process, I wanted to kind of just share with you what's happening next with the Riverwalk. November 17th, mark your calendars, that will be our 3rd community event. We just decided on the date today, so the save the dates will be coming out very soon. So stay tuned to learn about this opportunity and how you can come see and discuss the design alternatives for the Riverwalk. So we're very excited about that. Following the community event, so here we are, fall 2016 community event. Following that, I just wanted to highlight a couple of different ways that we will, that you can provide input to the project. There will be community conversations that project staff are gonna basically get folks to, we're gonna try to get on their agendas from November, so following the event, from November to January, where we can come and present these design alternatives to existing community groups, and different local groups where is another opportunity that we can have a discussion or a conversation about these design alternatives. Also, in addition to that, we'll have an online survey that's going to be posted for a period of time where if you're unable to attend the in-person event, you'll be able to log in online and provide feedback. So following all of that information, all of that input is really going to help us form the roadmap for the conceptual design leading to a preferred alternative, which we are on schedule to present to the public in early 2017. So we're looking at February, March to unveil the preferred plan. But from there, we've got a lot of work to do to get us to a point where we can begin construction. That being said, we've got engineering and costing, developing construction documents, permitting. That's going to take us over the next year and a half to get us to a phase 1 construction project, which we are highlighting as beginning that in mid-2018. So we've got a lot of work cut out for us, but right now we're in the stage where we're really excited to get input from everybody so that we can really inform these design options well. So the next slide, thank you, Christina, is our teaser image of the team's sectional approach to this site. However, I want to just put a caveat in. There are multiple concepts being considered at this point in the process or the project, and that this is by no means a final design. However, it gives you some sort of indication of how the design team is thinking about how we will present information to the public. So please come to the event on November 17th. We will unveil sort of locations of or details of the location and timing and all of that. So stay tuned to learn more. So thank you for coming out tonight. We are very appreciative of your enthusiasm and your excitement, and I just wanted to remind you all one more time, we've got these nifty cards where we would love to get your thoughts, your feedback. If you want to draw or sketch or write, however you want to share information with us, we will take it. So you can hand it to me or Christina or anybody else on the project staff, or if you need more time to stew over it, please take it home. You can mail them or email them. The information is on the bottom of the card. So thanks for coming out tonight, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. There was one thing I wanted to mention. We will be having an encore performance, so your friends and family, if they want to see it, we just confirmed that as well. It's going to be December 1st, but it's actually going to be at a different location. It's going to be at the Lake Theater in Lake Oswego. Clackamas County Historical Society is reaching out to other libraries, and they are trying to create more partnerships, and I'm really excited to bring this history to people around the region. So you'll keep up on our website and our blog and our social media, and we'll get more information out. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.